China has about 1,000 deliverable nuclear weapons. We have about 5,500. And I would think that if they decide to cross the South China Sea, or the Taiwan Strait, I should say, they could probably take Taiwan. It would be very costly, but they could probably take it. But if we tried to prevent that with a carrier group, I don't think it would and then we put it in the Taiwan Strait, I don't think it would last 1 minute. They have the ability to launch 5,000 or 6,000 small surface-to-ship missiles or drones at 2 inches above the water at night, and you couldn't stop that. And they could take out a $14 billion carrier and 5,000 sailors. So what would we do in response to that? And what would they do in response to that? And what would Russia do? What would India do? What would North Korea do? All of these things can happen.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast, number 208. And this episode is with a repeat past guest, Victor Davis Hanson, who is a renowned classicist and political commentator here at Stanford University. And he's also a leading military historian, and it is this particular expertise of Victor's that I take advantage in this conversation, because he just released his most recent book, The End of Everything: How Wars Descend into Annihilation, on May 7th. The book goes into a few historical cases of absolute military annihilation, ranging from Alexander the Great's conquest of Thebes to the annihilation of the Aztec Empire. And along the way, we talk about viewing historical events through today's moral lenses, the distinction between annihilation and genocide, some of the genocides going on in the present, what some of the current biggest military existential threats might be to the United States, and then also the likelihood of World War III. Victor, as I mentioned, is a repeat guest. He was also on episode 112, where we discussed his views on the history and shifting contemporary threads of citizenship, and then episode 191, which was part of a 6-installment series on the crisis in Israel and Palestine, in which I sampled a number of different views on the topic. And there are links to Victor's website, to his Twitter, to his podcast, to his last two books, The Dying Citizen, and then the one we discussed today, The End of Everything, in the description. On my end, reviews, especially on Spotify and Apple, are greatly appreciated, as are comments. And there is a Patreon if you would like to support the show, if you would like links to or a link to an ad-free RSS feed, or if you would like some show notes. And now, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Victor. The book is titled The End of Everything: How Wars Descend into Annihilation. And correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but you use annihilation somewhat synonymously or interchangeably with genocide. So I just want to think about how you're defining the annihilation of a people or genocide in this book.
Or maybe even further synonymously with extinction. And by that I mean not just, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, genocide never kills every single person. The Armenian genocide, the Holocaust genocide. But this is a little different even than that. This is a situation in which the defeated are not just killed off, or in some cases in the ancient world, they're enslaved, but their defeat and their physical space is destroyed. Their language is doomed, their culture disappears. So it would be as if in the Holocaust situation, there were no more Jewish people, there was no more Yiddish or Hebrew language, there was no more Jewish religion. and the Jewish people as a distinct entity disappeared. Sort of what Iran is threatening all the time. And it's very rare. And then there's, of course, it's hard. You get a typology, and Greece did not disappear, but the Boeotians, as embodied by the Thebans, did. In other words, all the people who claimed to be Thebans with a particular dialect of Boeotian and a particular physical space and a particular history were wiped out by Alexander, with just a few minor exceptions. The descendants of the poet Pindar, some religious officials, and anybody lucky to be out of the city at the time, either as an exile or on business. Everybody else was annihilated. The language, the Boeotian, the idea of a Theban Boeotian disappeared. The physical structure was raised after probably 2,000 years. And the physical space was important. It was centrally located. So there was a Thebes that was recreated by the Macedonians, but it wasn't from the original settlers. The same thing was true of Carthage. All the Carthaginians were wiped out or enslaved. The Punic language disappeared within a generation. Punic customs, I mean, they were isolated Punic customs, but there was never a known entity as the Punic language or Punic religion. Even in Augustine's time, he mentions people who, that the modern Berbers were related to the original Carthaginian, somewhat related to them. They were intermarried, but it disappeared as an entity. There was a new Carthage that was refounded about 10 or 12 miles from the old Carthage, but it was a Roman colony. And the same is true of Tenochtitlan. The Aztec Empire was destroyed. The city was razed. The people who claimed to be Aztec were wiped out or enslaved. A new city arose, mostly built by the Tlaxcalans and the Spanish, called, as we know it, Mexico City. It didn't mean there weren't people wandering around that spoke the Aztec dialect of Nahuatl, or that there are not people today who say they're indigenous and speak that general pre-Spanish or pre-Columbian language. But there is no Aztec entity. There's no Aztec religion. There's no Aztec people after Cortez destroyed them. And I think, just to finish, the same is true of the idea of Christian Greek speakers in Asia Minor as an entity. They're after 1453. It's a little different because the physical space was damaged but not destroyed. It was sort of like the DNA was changed. The Ottomans saw the location, they saw the beautiful city, and they thought, rather than destroy it, we'll just recalibrate it. So Hagia Sophia becomes a mosque. Most of the religious shrines are turned into Islamic shrines. But the actual, to the degree there's any Byzantine Christian Greeks still there, it's either that they're enslaved or they work under special serf-like conditions for the Sultanate, or they're dispersed out in the countryside and they're hiding somewhere. And most of the Greek-speaking Black Sea minor states are wiped out within a generation after the fall of Constantinople. And today there are, there was and I mentioned in the epilogue, there was an attempt in 1921-22 to create a megala idea, and that is to recreate Byzantine Christian presence or dominance in Asia Minor, and that failed with a complete annihilation of the city of Smyrna.
So your concern in the end of everything, like you said, it really goes beyond genocide to the total annihilation, people and culture included, so that they only exist as a historical memory. Then before we get into some of the specifics, and I wanted to start with Alexander the Great, you, as you already said, you sort of trace some general conclusions and ideas in these first 4 chapters, and they get applied to the present a bit in the epilogue. But what are some of the main reasons that these annihilation events occur, at least as you trace out in these historical episodes?
Well, you have to look at the attack and the nature of the attacker. If you start with the attacker, usually the attack don't really understand who the attacker is, or they miscalibrate. So Alexander is 21 years old. And they have been dealing, the Greeks, for 20 years with his father, Philip. He's the one that created the Macedonian army who invaded Greece, who was successful. They have seen Alexander 3 years earlier at the Battle of Chaeronea, but he's 21. And when Philip is assassinated, they even think he got killed. They're not even sure he's alive. There's all these claimants with much more age and experience to the Macedonian throne. And then even when he seems to inherit the kingdom and is going to march on their rebellious city, they think that he's the student of Aristotle, and that he's a man who believes in the brotherhood of the brotherhood of man. That's what his propaganda is, and that he wants to unite all the Greeks in the League of Corinth to go invade the Persians and pay them back for Marathon, Salamis, Plataea, the invasions of Greeks. So they don't know who he is. Same thing with the Carthaginians. They see Scipio Aemilianus, who finally takes over the siege, and they think, well, he's just another Roman general, and we fought them in 2 Punic wars and lost, and we had terms, we had fines, we'll have one again. And he's a man of letters. He's accompanied by the intellectual historian and Roman historian Polybius. He's created a Scipionic circle of playwrights and intellectuals. He wouldn't do this. And the same thing with Mehmed. He's just a 21-year-old kid, and they said, we dealt with his father, we dealt with his great-grandfather, we know how to deal. They have concessions here in Constantinople. He wouldn't do this. He's got a big library. He says he's the successor to the Caesars. And Cortez, they didn't know who he was. They didn't know if he was a god at first or he was a superhuman, but they looked at this paltry little army, and they had no idea who they were dealing with, 500. And then at no time in the 2-year conquest was there more than 1,500 Spaniards at any one time. And there was probably 300,000 Aztecs in the main city and 4 million in the empire. And what they didn't realize is they weren't dealing with the pilgrims, families from Britain that were on their way to North America. They were dealing with the most accomplished warriors in Europe at that time, who had been fighting Muslims in the Reconquista for 200 years. They'd been fighting Venetians. They had been fighting Florentines. They'd been fighting almost every type of Italians. And they'd been fighting the Ottomans. And so when they got to the New World, they were dealing with master swordsmen, Spanish steel, Toledo blades. They had no idea what they were up against. And so the same thing is true of the Constantine XII and the Byzantines. They thought, well, Mehmet wouldn't do this. He just wouldn't do it. There's too many advantages. So they misinterpret the attacker and what his intentions are, and then they themselves are living on the fumes of past ascendance, glory, power. So the Byzantines say nobody has ever in the history of the city taken the Theodosian walls. It's absolutely impossible. It's the greatest fortifications in the history of the world. It's a tripartite killing system. And indeed, even in the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders couldn't break through the land wall. Just a fluke, they went in through the sea walls. Carthage had the most impressive fortification in the ancient world, much more impressive than the Roman walls. And Thebes was famous in myth for the 7-gated Thebes. So all of these people thought they were impenetrable. The Aztecs had even a more sophisticated defense. It was sort of like Venice, with a series of locks and canals on a huge lake, and they thought that no one can ever get into Tenochtitlan because we can control the access and flood people or trap them on the causeways. So there was a sense on the attack that they never said to themselves, are we more powerful than our ancestors? Are we in ascendance? Are we descending? Do we still have the ability to fight? They didn't understand that at all. They were very naive, all of them were. The Carthaginians were given an ultimatum by the invading army. It said, turn over all your weapons and we will come to terms with you, and we can have an armistice. They did. And then the Romans said, oh, by the way, the armistice means you have to destroy your city and move it 10 miles inland. And they were shocked. And the same thing with the Thebans. They thought, well, he's here and he's going to besiege a city, and when we lose, he'll do what he always does. He'll give us terms. He had no idea that he was going to destroy the city, even though he warned them he was. So there's a lot of, and I think that's true. That paradigm is applicable today too. I think people say, well, Putin and people in the Russian parliament have threatened nuclear weapons, especially, but they would never do it. They would never do it. And Iran keeps talking about Israel as a one-bomb state, or it's going to destroy the Zion. It would never do it. Couldn't do it. Won't do it. I'm not sure that's true. It's likely, but it's not certain. And when you're talking about existential destruction, you want to be 99.999 sure that it doesn't happen.
One thing that stuck out to me as I was reading this book was it reminded me in a way, I mean, obviously they're very different texts, but it reminded me in a way of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, just in that, particularly in the epilogue, when you're making salient all of these points, such as the three that you just mentioned, the attacked does not understand the attacker, the attacker is quite prideful, the attacked is prideful, and they don't realistically evaluate their own capacities. It could very much be applied to the business world today. And I just found that kind of funny as I was reading. Do people ever try to consult with you for business purposes?
I've had people, not necessarily business, because they know, we're talking about business people, not just average people, but people who are CEOs and stuff. But they've asked me questions of human nature, for example. They'll call people I know, and I know a lot of CEOs and people have been very successful, I suppose, and they'll say things like, I make all this money and my relatives don't, so I give them $17,000 for each kid, each cousin, and the more that I give them money, the more they resent me. And then why is that? And I'll talk about envy and Hesiod, or top boy in Greek literature, where the more that you show magnanimity, the less it's reciprocated in kind. It's more philosophical questions, or they'll talk about deterrence. I've had people in the military ask about deterrence, especially, and I've tried to explain it's very hard to achieve. It's very easy to surrender, but it's just all deterrence is. I think the classical definitions are a little bit mistaken when they say it's literally, as the Latin implies, discouraging somebody from being aggressive by demonstration or assurances or transmission of knowledge that in a cost-to-benefit analysis they have more to lose than to gain, and therefore they won't do it. So in the 19th century, you sent a big ship into the harbor of a neutral to show power. That's still true, but I think it's more that ignorance, that there are powers, there's Iran, there's Russia, there's China, there's Hamas, there's Hezbollah, there's Israel, and there's us. And when the powerful nations do not make it clear, their potential to inflict damage, the real capability, I should say, and their intent to use it, then powers that are weaker make stupid decisions. And they say, well, I'm not sure after Afghanistan, I'm not sure the United States is strong anymore. Or they let a balloon go through, or they turned over $50 billion worth of weaponry to the Taliban. Or in the case of Israel, Hamas said, well, they have massive protests in the streets about a Supreme Court decision, and they're letting 20,000 of us come into Israel every day as day workers, and they're paying us 3 times what we could get. And they just don't seem the old Israelis anymore. And so when that happens, then war is seen as a corrective. It's a lab experiment. I mean, it's not the lab experiment. It's the result of the lab experiment. It doesn't have to take place. If World War in 1941, when Hitler declared war on us and earlier Russia, 6 months earlier, any sane person would have said to him, and many did, Herr Hitler, your alliance of Japan and Italy has 1/4 the population, a fraction of the GDP, a fraction of the national resources of what you've now combined against us, the British Empire, the United States, and Soviet Russia. This is insane. There's no way we can win this war. And he would have answered, as he did, well, the British they don't fight. They appeased us all during the 30s. And the Americans are isolationists. And the Russians had the Molotov, they begged us. And so you could say appeasement, isolation, collaboration disguise the real military strength of these powers, and then the lesser power did something stupid. And then war is necessary to correct those beliefs. So when the war is over, then you could say, well, guess what? Russia, the United States, and the British Empire were a hell of a lot stronger than Japan, Italy, and Germany, but we had to have 65 million dead to prove that obvious fact. And why? Because people did not make their potential known at the outset. So if we had had clear demonstrations of what would happen if Hamas went in there earlier, I think we wouldn't have had this happen. And I think we're in danger now of sending a message of proportionality or tit for tat. I'll give you an example. If on the eve of the Israeli messaging to the United States and back and forth, the United States said, well, you can hit back but it has to be within limits. Within limits. That's what we were told. And they told the Iranians the same thing. They said after they took out the Republican Guard grandees in Damascus, we expect your attack to be within limits. And that was disguising reality. And the reality is that the Israelis had the ability to do enormous damage to the Iranians, and the Iranians didn't have the ability necessarily to do it to the Israelis. So what did within limits mean when you say to the Iranians, strike within limits? 5 dead Jews, 100 Israelis, 2,000? They didn't know that, so they were going to press their luck and find out where. Had they said the following, we want to assure you that not one of hundreds of missiles or drones that you send into Israel will hit the target, because not only will the Israelis knock the ballistic missiles down, but we and the British and others, maybe even Arabs, will knock down your drones. However, that's the reality. However, if you send one missile and try to test that reality, you're going to regret it, because there's going to be a retaliation that's going to take out your grid, your nuclear. Then they wouldn't have done it if they believed you. And so then you have these wars to reconfirm or reestablish who is strong and who is weak, when there are mechanisms to prevent it before you have to go to war.
I want to return to those factors you mentioned that contribute to these annihilation events. And the first that you mentioned, and in particular with regard to Thebes, was that the Thebans did not understand their attacker. They didn't know much about Alexander the Great. They thought he would be an Aristotelian in some salient sense. And I'm quite curious about the psychology of some of these historical figures, and maybe even their moral psychology. And maybe we can start with Alexander the Great. But before I ask about his psychology, what were the general circumstances that led to his conquering Thebes?
Well, first of all, they thought he had been assassinated, or they thought that he would not win the contest because he had several stepbrothers and uncles. So they weren't sure who was in charge. And then it's about 300 miles from Macedon to Thebes. So when they revolted and killed or imprisoned the Macedonian peacekeeping force or contingent guards, they were ecstatic, and they thought everybody was going to break out. And so they sent word, and the Spartans said yes, the Arcadians said yes, the Athenians said, we'll help you. And before they knew it, they had no idea what Alexander was like, or that he was absolutely a very rare military genius. He'd shown that at Chaeronea, and he got that 300 miles in 10 days. So he literally pulled up in less than 2 weeks out in front of their walls. And then they didn't know what he would do, and he started to build siege engines right that day to take the city. And they didn't understand that his army, they thought they were going to go outside the walls and fight a conventional battle. They had done that at Chaeronea, and they didn't realize that the Macedonian army was a revolutionary thing of terror. Its spears were not spears. They were sarissas. They were 18 feet long. Theirs were only 9. The first 5 rows of the phalanx could hit the enemy. The Greeks only the first 3. They had combined cavalry. They had light armed troops. They had missile troops. They were professionals. They weren't citizen soldiers. So they didn't know fully why Macedon was so powerful, and they didn't understand that Alexander had a grand vision of getting to Persia as quickly as possible and using Greek resources along with Macedonian. And in his way of thinking, I have to make an example out of this city so that when I'm gone, nobody will revolt in my rear. And all of that was not a mystery. There were people who knew that. And yet, when they tried to voice those opinions, they were shouted down or exiled or ridiculed. And the Spartans, they got to the isthmus and they said, no, we're not going to go any further. We understand that he's on his way. We understand. We know who he is. And we want no part of this revolt. And then all of a sudden, everybody said that. He said, we hear he's going to pull up any minute. He's not assassinated. He's not dead. He's capable. He's a madman. And he's going to destroy you. And we're not going to lift a finger to help you. And then they found themselves in a dilemma. At that point, they should have surrendered and saved the city. And he probably would. He offered them terms if they gave up the revolutionaries who had started the rebellion.
What did he do with the city and people after the battle in which he defeated them? So what makes this constitute an annihilation event?
Well, in very loud forms, he said he was a admirer of the poet Pindar, who had been dead for over 100 years. But so he said, I am going to save the house of Pindar, and I'm going to save religious officials. But in the actual battle that day, there were probably 4,000 or 5,000 Thebans that were killed during the siege. And we don't know exactly the population of ancient Thebes, but a good guess is somewhere between 15 and 20,000. So women and children were enslaved. That children usually was somewhere between 16 and 14 would be survived. And all the males, and there may have been 10,000 of them who were not killed, were executed. And we don't know how many escaped. There's some in one of our sources that says some people rode off on horses and got to the Gulf. We don't know. But then he leveled the city. It had Mycenaean roots, so it was enormous. The city was destroyed in 335, but we know that there had been continuous habitation there since about 1600 BC, monumental civilization. And this was the home of all of the embryo of Greek mythology. So when you were an Athenian and you went to the tragic theater, the plays that you watched by Euripides or Aeschylus or Sophocles, the premier or the marquee plays were all about the House of Thebes. They were Antigone, they were Oedipus Rex, they were Oedipus at Colonus, they were the women of Trachis. That was the legendary plays. It was the Bacchae of Euripides. So nobody thought that this iconic city would be destroyed. It would be as almost if somebody destroyed New York, or maybe not New York because it's so big, but it was something that was a fixture of Hellenic civilization. And it had been in the 530s, 540s, 550s, 560s, for 50 years, it had taken over the leadership of Greece from Sparta and Athens under the legendary general Epaminondas. It was a Pythagorean, radical, democratic, very volatile, powerful force in Greek powers. It had almost united most of Greece. And they had new ways of fighting, and they were democratic zealots. And they had built huge cities in the Peloponnese, and people thought, whatever Thebes does will work, or we'll follow Thebes. But Thebes was no match for the Macedonian.
You said that Alexander wanted to create an example out of Thebes, and I understand from a pragmatic level, or on a pragmatic level, that he wanted vengeance, he wanted to preclude retaliation, maybe he wanted to make money as he built this empire and to win allies. But what do you think was going on in his head from a moral perspective? Because as you mentioned, the Thebans thought he was an Aristotelian. And did he ever explain this in writings, or did he display regret for the violence on that day?
He supposedly did later. There were anecdotal passages, and I mean anecdotal in historians that are not otherwise concerned with Thebes, that while on his 10-year crusade that destroyed the Persian Empire, when he encountered people from Thebes or Boeotia, maybe they were in exile or a child that had grown up, he was deferential to them. And at one point he said he didn't mean to do it. And when the city was refounded by Cassander, one of his successors, who, when he died, of course, they had this 2 decades long war all over the ancient world to inherit the empire that he created. One of the factions was an anti-Alexander faction, said, okay, you guys, Antipater or Antigonus, you may be the true heir of Alexander, but what Alexander did was wrong, and I'm going to represent Greece, and I'm going to refound Thebes and rectify the damage that Alexander did to the Greek people as a propaganda tool to unify Greeks under his dictatorship. So, but the point is, there was a lot of people who hadn't seen anything like it quite. In the Peloponnesian War, there had been 2 tiny little towns, or maybe 3, Scione, Torone, Milos. But not when Athens lost the war, there was a debate about what to do with it. And actually, the Thebans wanted to destroy it. And that was just considered an anathema. And they didn't destroy it. And Greeks typically didn't do that. And, Romans typically didn't do that either. But after the destruction of Carthage, they did. That same year, they destroyed the Greek city of Corinth. And so this is going to inaugurate a new page, that the absolute destruction of a civilization is considered permissible. And I accentuate throughout the book, it's very rare. I mean, people have said to me, well, we annihilated the Japanese. No, we didn't. They had a population of 75 million people. They lost 2.5 million people in that war. In fact, the Japanese army killed more people in terms of how many, in the ratio of how many they lost, than any other army or military in World War II. They killed over 15 million Chinese, probably 4 million Asians, probably 800,000 Westerners, and they lost about 2.5 million civilian and military people. And Japan, of course, recovered very quickly, was rebuilt under different auspices. Same with Germany. But we haven't seen that much, but we have weapons. It's hard to. People think that the moral sense has evolved more quickly than technology has, and that's one of the themes in the book, that it not only hasn't, but it might have regressed. And it's much easier to wipe out I think people think with globalization you can't wipe out a society, but a lot of people think you can. Mr. Erdogan has told the Greeks that one morning they're going to wake up and they're going to look at a sea of missiles in the sky coming from Turkey. And he said the Armenians will be dealt with in the same fashion that our 19th century ancestors dealt with them. And of course, these things happen when there's a limited population. This isn't the Carthaginian Empire or the First Punic War of 20 million people. You're down to 500,000 people. And the same thing with Byzantium and Thebes. And so there's only 2.5 million Armenians in the world today. And they're all concentrated, the people who actually speak Armenian, the Armenian Orthodox, except for a small diaspora, they're all in Armenia, landlocked and dependent, on ports and fuel and resources on Russia for the most part. And they're very vulnerable. So are the Kurds, so are the Greeks. Greeks, I think, are especially vulnerable given what Turkey's been doing, not to mention Israel.
I actually didn't know about this dispute over Cyprus between Greece and Turkey before reading your book, and hopefully in a few minutes we'll get to some of the contemporary implications of the work. But first, I'd like to dig into this question that you've just raised about moral progress. So the historian's job, beyond doing the research, the translations in your case, and getting the facts right, is to weave a narrative and put all of these things together. But I wonder where you think the historian's contemporary, evaluative voice belongs in all of this. So how do you evaluate as an historian in the present whether what Alexander did was right or wrong, whether the enslavement or executions or the annihilation in general was justified?
Well, I don't think the historian uses the current morality or professed morality of the present and then goes back and looks at history as winners and losers and tries to find victims and victimizers according to present sense of propriety or morality. What I think the historian does is they look at the past when they want to make a moral judgment, and they take two things into consideration. Everlasting values that are transcended. It's always wrong to murder somebody. In most societies, even if they do it, they consider it it's wrong. And then the prevailing morality at the time. So when you look at Alexander, did city-states in the Peloponnesian or Persian Wars or the Theban Wars, when they lost, were they completely surrounded and annihilated? And the answer is, in 2 or 3 cases of Athenian exuberance, they were, and the Athenians lived to regret doing that. The Melians, for example, Thucydides makes it clear that the Athenians were pretty awful in doing that. And Euripides wrote a play, The Suppliant Women, that had a lot of reflections on the destruction of Melos. It was considered a stain on the Athenian character. And it was mentioned by others at the end of the Peloponnesian War that they should pay back Xenophon, the Athenians, and annihilate them for what they did. So given them, what I'm getting at is you can assess what the general morality of the times was, and then to see if they were excessive. The morality of 1945 is different than it is today, but what the Germans did and what the Japanese did exceeds considerably what the British and the Americans did. And therefore you can make a moral judgment, I think. And then you have to, as long as you don't whitewash one particular power or entity and say, well, they weren't as bad as the other people, but you also have to say, according to contemporary morality, they weren't as bad, but in terms of transcendent humankind, what they did to our sense is repugnant. You can say that without condemning them, it seems to me, but in modernist terms. What we're doing now as historians, we're saying that Western civilization sent 11 million slaves to the New World, and therefore they're utterly reprehensible and unredeemable. And then you say to yourself, well, a couple of things. The Muslim world, do you feel the same thing about the Muslim world? It probably took a couple of million more to the Middle East and never had an abolitionist movement, as did the West. And who was the first civilization to actually free slaves? And why did slavery persist for so long and the answer probably was it wasn't predicated on race until the 16th century. And so that if you were enslaved, people just said, it could happen to me too. It's just bad luck. And so, but usually today's historians don't consider things like that. They're just so eager to get contemporary resonance by condemning somebody in the past in simplistic terms.
Maybe to see if I understand the position correctly. So an interesting historical project would be to understand how these historical figures like Alexander the Great acted relative to the moral standards of their contemporaries, maybe because this can really illuminate something about history and the figures' psychologies. But it's not so much a legitimate project to judge these figures based on the standards of the present, because that's something like, to speak figuratively or colloquially, it's just something to earn brownie points or to get resonance, as you put it.
Yeah, and you have to consider that we stand on the shoulders of hundreds of generations that supposedly had some greater experience each generation with moral questions and ironed out solutions that were adjudicated, improved on, rejected, discussed. But we got to the point where we decided that enslaving somebody was wrong, or we got to the point where infanticide was wrong. But we have to keep this. I think it's very important for the historian to have humility. So I don't know what a historian 50 years is going to say when they look at the streets of the major cities of America. They're going to say something happened, after 2015, 20, where 1 million people began defecating, fornicating, injecting, urinating in the very down streets on the public space without a home, and people just innocent. It was like a medieval city, awful excrement. No one cared. They just did it. What kind of society allows that to happen? Or when the pro-abortion people say, well, I mean, it's reasonable to consider, say, 8 or 9 weeks. It's not, I don't think it's reasonable to consider 8 or 9 weeks a ban on abortion, but let's say 15. But the pro-abortionist stance says, well, there's only 8,000 or 9,000 out of 1 million abortions that are partial birth abortions. Very small, but maybe a future generation will say, wait a minute. At the zenith of American civilization, there was 8,000 to 10,000 babies who went through the birth canal and were breathing and would have been viable in a second or two longer, and you executed them. So what I'm getting at is I don't have the answers of what they will say, but it's important to think what they could say, because it suggests that it gives you a little bit of humility. But today's historians are so confident that they have the answers, and they're so morally superior to the subjects that they write about. They have no idea that somebody's going to write about them.
Mm-hmm. Shifting more to these contemporary issues, I think you wrote about these 4 particular incidents because they loom so huge in the history of human civilization. But you also write that it is hard to find a total annihilation on this scale after that of the Aztecs. And I think one reason that you cite is the increased globalization of peoples. You no longer have an entire people and their culture localized in one small space. But I'm wondering if in today's world you do see any particular annihilation events or events verging on becoming an annihilation event, and one that comes to mind that I don't know much about personally, but that seems to not be getting nearly enough time on the news as it should, is whatever is happening in China with the Uyghur minority. But I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that particular event, or if there are any others that come out to you.
Well, we know there's 1 million Uyghurs that are in, we would call them concentration, they would call them labor retreats or something. But we don't really, I think there's 6 or 7 million of them, and we don't really know what the ultimate Chinese purpose is. We do know that radical Islam that is anti-Western doesn't say a thing about the Uyghurs. It doesn't seem to be worried about them. It doesn't seem to worry when Putin leveled Grozny and probably killed over 200,000 Chechens in the Second Chechen War. I don't remember protests as we see now on behalf of Hamas. I don't see protests against the Chinese embassy about the Uyghurs. So radical Islam, as it's manifested in the United States at least, is concerned about one thing, purported Western sin, but it is completely it's not predicated on the actual number of Muslims who are suffering. If it were, then the Russians and Chinese would be prime offenders, which means that they pretty much feel they can do what they want. And so that's one criterion in today. Anti-Semitism is another. I tried to find the original quote from Mr. Rafsanjani, who's still alive, when he said that the nice thing about Israel, it's a one-bomb state. And what he meant was, if you read the entire speech, is that after World War II, the Israelis thought they were making a safe sanctuary so that you would not have a second Holocaust. And therefore, they got all of the Israelis who wanted to learn modern Hebrew, the descendant of ancient Hebrew. They would actually be pious and devout Jews in a religious sense, and they would have this culture, whereas the diaspora, people were being intermarried, and they were forgetting, they didn't speak Yiddish anymore, they didn't speak Hebrew, of course, they weren't observant. So the real Jewish culture was now in Israel, and he thought that was a good thing, because with a few nuclear bombs, you could wipe the whole thing out. And the Jews, he said, had made it easier for Iran. And that's actually a topos in Iranian militant rhetoric, that they think they're saving Jews, but actually they're making it easier for us when we get the bomb. So that's something to watch. And it only, given nuclear weapons, if they develop, I don't know, a 30 or 40 kiloton bomb, and they sent, say, 700 missiles through at Israel, and we didn't know which 2 or 3 had a 20 or 30 kiloton bomb on it. It's even with Israel's superb defenses, it's you could see that could happen, and then you have to play out the scenario as I did when I wrote these 4 case studies. What would be the reaction of the world to that? I think the Shia then would be famous throughout the Islamic world, because they would say, well, Israel retaliated in their last gasp and they killed 40 million of us, but we have 80 million. And the Shia, not the Sunni, the Persians, not the Arabs, were the ones that wiped out Israel for good. And they would look at that as both the people who died in the retaliation as martyrdom, and the accomplishment they would feel would live on for centuries, and it would be worth it in their value system. So that means, as I see it, that it's possible that could happen. Very possible. And that's why I don't think that our administration understands that, and therefore applies a set of rules to Israel that's oblivious to what its enemies intend for it. And so I guess what I'm saying, there's a lot of scenarios in which it could happen today. It wouldn't take much, as I said earlier, to wipe out the Armenians. We just had this dispute where 100,000 Armenians were ethnically cleansed from Nabarak or whatever, Nabarak, the corridor right next to Azerbaijan and Armenia, and they just wiped them out. They'd been there for centuries, and they had to flee back into Armenia. And there's, as I said, it's when you look at places in the world, you want to see how many people are there, how many people speak the language, what's the environment, what's the nature of their enemy. And Turkey it's funny. I don't want to be Turkophobic, but when you look at vulnerable peoples and who is threatening them with existential annihilations, Mr. Erdogan comes up again and again. He's threatened the Greeks, he's threatened the Armenians, and he's threatened the Kurds, and now he's threatened the Israelis. He said one day the Israelis are going to look up and our Turkish missiles will be descending upon them, and they better be careful because there may be a Turkish army in Gaza. And so he's threatened almost every, and he does have visions that he's a new sultan. He's praised the Ottomans. And he talks about 1453 as a glorious moment when they extinguished Christian Western influence that had been there for, in the case of Constantinople since 333 AD.
Given that we're both Americans in the United States, and we haven't really touched much on annihilation events that could occur for Americans, I feel like we ought to take the last few minutes maybe to discuss what you think as the biggest, or what you think are the biggest existential threats to our existence as a people right now.
Well, you can see the threat of the COVID virus killed 1 million people, we were told, out of 335 million. But the lockdown with the idea that you're going to quarantine and separate people in a sophisticated society for almost 2 years. If you look at spousal abuse, suicides, familial abuse, missed cancer screenings, drug abuse, substance abuse, paranoias, I think what that did was really scary, because I think it explained the reaction to George Floyd. I think it explained the 120 days of rioting and looting and killing in May, June, July, August of 2020. I think it had something to do with January 6th. So that's just a small thing that can happen to a society. But I guess the question is whether it's gradual or sudden. I don't think that a country can destroy us with a nuclear weapon, because we have some missile defense, not very good yet, but we have a retaliatory deterrent that stops China or Russia from doing something. So what we're more like is what happened to Rome. And it depends. I mean, Latin is not a spoken language today. The Western culture from Rome continued, but the idea of a Roman people in North Africa, in Asia Minor, in the Balkans is no longer exist. So it doesn't mean the United States is always going to be in Arizona or Maine, even if there's remnants. So what would do that? What would trigger that? We owe $35 trillion in debt, and we're spending $1 trillion every 100 days, borrowing it, printing it. And historically, when that happens, you can inflate your way out, and we have almost wrecked the economy and people's lives by increasing prices since 2020 and 30% on staples, gas, food, rent, insurance. Or you can appropriate wealth, and people have talked about that, giving credit for your 401k in terms of Social Security years of contributions. That 401k is not really yours. You didn't build it, and we'll take it and give you Social Security credit. Or we can cancel debt. Just say, you have too much money anyway. That seems preposterous, but when you see squatters and people are saying, well, you have 500 acres. If they squat on 200 acres or 2 acres, it doesn't really bother you. Or you have a 5-bedroom vacation house. If somebody uses the pool house, what do you care? So you're starting to see that incrementalism about questioning the law. The other thing that can destroy a society very quickly is the erosion of the law, or the asymmetrical practice of the law, or the application. And so I guess what I'm saying is, if you and I had gone down to San Francisco in 2014 and we would go there today, people in 2014 wouldn't have believed it. They wouldn't have believed there was a streetman on Market Street. They wouldn't believe people smash a window and walk out with Apple computers with no consequences. They wouldn't believe that there's cars with placards that say "car unlocked, nothing here, please don't take," on the streets of San Francisco. They wouldn't believe that if your car is broken into and you call the police, no one's going to come. They wouldn't believe there's actual major figures in California cultural life, San Francisco's cultural life, that say that's nothing wrong with looting or there's nothing wrong with living on the street. So that's a sign of gradual or insidious civilizational decay. I think, and the thing to remember is you never really know what's going on when you're in the middle of it. It always requires you to stand back and say, what was life like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years ago, 50 years ago? What was the dollar worth? What was the debt per GDP? What was the GDP or the debt per GDP or the debt per population 1950 or 1960 or 1970? Did anybody ever believe that 43,000 people would be short as recruitment to the military? It's never happened before. We have the largest population in American history, and we have the largest shortfall since the volunteer army was formed. We're 7 years behind in javelin production. So we're giving weapons all over the world, but we're not producing them. We're just depleting our stocks on the presumption that we won't be in an existential conundrum. So there's a lot of things to see besides bioweapons or there's been reports of artificial intelligence experiments of computer simulations in the Pentagon where they will program into, say, a missile launch every single scenario that would endanger the effectiveness of it hitting the target, other missiles, weather, airplanes, shooting them down, whatever, lasers. But there was a good case, it was in Newsweek not too long ago, that they forgot about the kill button in the launcher. And they didn't realize that the artificial intelligence program was not static. It was trying to assess new data as they launched the missile, not in real terms, but on a computer. And they found out when the experiment was going to be over, the person just nonchalantly pushed the kill button, and that triggered the missile to turn around and see a threat and go right back to the person who launched it. And then they canceled the project in kind of terror of the simulation. So things like that can happen very easily. So I'm kind of worried about that, actually. If you were having a missile defense system or a nuclear deterrent and you had a sophisticated AI component without proper, and we don't know what proper oversight would be with AI. We don't know what level whether it's accruing knowledge and autonomy geometrically, arithmetically, I don't know. But there's a lot of things to see. I happen to farm as well as be a professor, and I can tell you that people walking into Whole Foods in Palo Alto and think they're going to get beautiful, affordable fruits and shiny cantaloupes and plums and peaches and asparagus, fresh, disease-free, and they have no idea exactly what is entailed about government policy to ensure water or to ensure affordable equipment or affordable fossil fuels that are essential to produce that. And should that break down, they have no idea how to feed themselves. They don't know how to. If you gave them a pig, they wouldn't know how to skin it. If you said grow some asparagus, they wouldn't know what to do. Few of them might. So all of these things, the more sophisticated and more Mycenaean we get, and knowledge is refined and distilled into a smaller and smaller governing class, the more vulnerable a society is. And it's better to be dispersed and to have knowledge and decentralized. And I don't see that happening. I see the average person getting less and less educated, and the schools dumbing down rather than trying to spread knowledge and civic education.
Just one last thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't press you on. So we've taught, or a number of potential existential threats have come up in this conversation. I mean, China, Russia, North Korea. I don't know if we mentioned North Korea, but Pakistan, Iran, Israel, Palestine, this conflict between Turkey and Greece. Do you not see a potential World War III as being a serious looming existential military threat for the United States?
No, I do. I really do. And it's easy to envision. China has about 1,000 deliverable nuclear weapons. We have about 5,500. And I would think that if they decide to cross the South China Sea, or the Taiwan Strait, I should say, they could probably take Taiwan. It would be very costly, but they could probably take it. But if we tried to prevent that with a carrier group, I don't think it would and then we put it in the Taiwan Strait, I don't think it would last 1 minute. They have the ability to launch 5,000 or 6,000 small surface-to-ship missiles or drones at 2 inches above the water at night, and you couldn't stop that. And they could take out a $14 billion carrier and 5,000 sailors. So what would we do in response to that? And what would they do in response to that? And what would Russia do? What would India do? What would North Korea do? All of these things can happen. And so it's if you're an American and, it's very important that you are able to convince people that this key to their peace and calm is to have as powerful a military as possible for deterrence, to protect your national interests, but more importantly, to protect the post-war world. And you can see it breaking down. If you look at major maritime corridors that were considered calm and open to world shipping, the Straits of Hormuz, essential to European import of oil. Iran just took a container ship and hijacked it right on the high seas, took it just stole it. If you look at the Red Sea, which is important to go through the Suez Canal, it's non-navigable. You can't navigate it because of Houthis' missiles. Insurance companies won't insure it. If you look at the Black Sea, it provided maritime commerce for a lot of different nations. It's not navigable now because of the Ukraine war and Russia Ukraine has sunk 1/3 of the Russian fleet, and Russia's forbidden a lot of countries to come into the Black Sea. If you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, the same thing. It's very treacherous to have a ship come in. So insidiously, without our awareness, this post-war order that was enforced by the United States, and we are confronted with debt and tribalism and a lack of confidence in our military, and we're not producing weaponry or wherewithal or economic heft to ensure this order of Western nations. Maybe our weakness will encourage the Europeans to step up, or the Australians or the British, who knows? But right now, China and Russia and Iran and North Korea and others feel that this is a moment of opportunity, that we are sort of like 5th century Rome in decline. And, decline is a choice. It's not inevitable. And we'll see what happens. But I'm a little worried about this administration because I think the United States is still very powerful, but some foreign powers may make the wrong conjectures that after the Afghanistan skedaddle and the Chinese spy balloon traversing with impunity and our lukewarm support for Israel, at least in certain matters, and the appearance of Joe Biden as being predictable and older and somewhat cognitively challenged, they'll think that this is a rare moment and they won't have another one like it. And there'll be a correction at some point, and now would be a good time. I think Putin thought that. I think Hamas thought that. And I think the Chinese are weighing in. They think we're going to watch and see what the next election's like and what's the ultimate fate of Ukraine versus Russia and how Israel does against Hezbollah and Iran, and what the United States response is. So it's going to be very dangerous, I think, especially up until January 21st of next year.
Victor, we've run the gamut on historical issues, contemporary issues, philosophical issues, speculative future issues. And I mean, as always, thanks again so much for coming on the show and continuing to have these conversations with me.
Thank you for having me.